Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Shelby and this is Merrily Morbid. Today's topic is one that I've been fascinated with for many years. It's a family of diseases that have baffled scientists for centuries, hide in the unsuspecting for decades, and kill within months. This group of diseases affect a protein in our bodies and cause them to go rogue, leaving tragedy in their wake. Today we will delve into the different members of the Prion family, 3 that affect animals and 4 that affect people. Prion diseases are also known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, named as such for how they affect the brains, and they resemble sponges under the microscope. Prion proteins are found throughout the body, but are most abundant in nerves and, of course, the brain. These prion proteins are folded in a very particular way, and for some people, a prion protein in the body will misfold. When these misfold, they cease to function, and that wouldn't be so dangerous if they didn't behave the way they do. These misfolded prion proteins corrupt any other prion protein that they touch, and those will cause any that they touch to misfold, and so on. They clump up as they misfold, and do damage to cells, and then those cells die. This chain reaction leads to brain death. As you can imagine, this is very scary, but it gets worse. How? There are no treatments or cures. Prions cannot be destroyed by heat, freezing, ultraviolet light does nothing, and chemical disinfectants are useless. How can it get any worse? Well, I'll tell you. Prion diseases are the only type of disease that can be inherited, acquired, and can just happen. Yes, they can just happen. It's rare, but the chance is never zero, as they say. Prion diseases are 100% fatal. And often diagnosis is delayed, not only because of how rare they are, but also because in the beginning stages, they appear to mimic so many other conditions such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So let's get into it. The first one to be discovered was one called Scrapie, named for how the animals scrape their bodies trying to satisfy an itch that cannot be scratched. It affects goats and sheep and originated over 2 centuries ago in Europe. There are 2 forms, the classical, found in Europe, and the atypical, which can be found worldwide. The difference between the 2 types is the classical type is infectious and behaves like a virus, and can spread from one animal to the other, whereas the atypical type occurs spontaneously and randomly, and is unlikely to spread from one animal to another. Like other prions, there is a long incubation period. That means from the time that the infection begins to when the symptoms actually appear. Also, like other prions, once symptoms appear, it isn't long before death follows. In the case of Scrapie, death occurs in 1 to 6 months. Yes, it's that quick. Death is quick but brutal. A piece of German literature on the basics of farming from 1759 had this to say: some sheep suffer from Scrapie, which can be identified by the fact that affected animals lie down, bite at their feet and legs, rub their backs against posts, fail to thrive, stop feeding, and eventually become lame. They drag themselves along, gradually becoming emaciated and die. Scrapie is incurable. The best solution is for a shepherd who notices one of his animals is suffering from Scrapie to dispose of it quickly and slaughter it away from the manorial lands for consumption by the servants of the nobleman. Did you catch that last bit? For consumption by the servants? Now, to be fair, Scrapie hasn't ever been shown to be a risk to humans, but it will not be the last time in these stories where the poor are the ones who face the risk of eating meat from these diseased animals. Another thing I would like to point out is that it was suggested that the animal be taken away from the manorial lands, meaning the land that the property is on, and for it to be slaughtered. Now, this is interesting because the land itself becomes contagious. It was observed at one point in Iceland. A flock of sheep had become infected and were therefore disposed of. The land that they had pastured on was left alone for an entire 10 years. 10 years. At that point, it had to be safe, right? Wrong. The farmers brought in a new flock of sheep to that land, thinking after 10 years it should be fine, only to have those sheep suffer the same fate as those before them. What those farmers didn't know was that the thing that they called Scrapie didn't behave in the same way as other types of illness known at the time. It wouldn't be until centuries later that it was discovered that Scrapie was in fact a prion. It was not a living thing like bacteria, and it didn't function like a virus, even though those things wouldn't be discovered for years later either. Let's fast forward to today. These days, we don't really worry about Scrapie, and for us in the US, we don't eat a lot of mutton or lamb, so it doesn't really seem to affect us. But in the 1960s, we discovered we had our own Prion disease in animals commonly hunted here. You may even be familiar with it if you hunt or live in a more rural area. Chronic wasting disease is a prion that has been found to affect deer, elk, moose, reindeer, or caribou. Animals with this suffer from weight loss and poor muscle control, and as the disease progresses, they display low head carriage and a fixed staring gaze. Then death follows, and in these animals is usually caused by aspiration pneumonia, where they develop inflammation and infection in the lungs from breathing in food or water due to that lack of muscle control. It is believed that incubation for chronic wasting disease is anywhere from 1.5 years up to 3 years. This disease can affect captive populations as well, and can affect nearly 100% of a captive herd due to the small quarters. In the wild, the prevalence is highly variable. It can be as low as 1% of animals in some areas and is known to reach 40% of animals in other areas. There is surveillance of this problem, and hunting these animals is encouraged, but you shouldn't eat the meat of these infected animals. Scrapie is not known to be transmissible to people, but because of the next prion that I'll discuss, we do know that that's not a rule that you can apply to all animals infected with prions. Not all of them are safe to eat. Now, if you're familiar with the term prion, it's most likely because of this next one. In scientific circles, it is known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. But to the general public, it is generally known as mad cow disease. The first cases appeared in 1986 in cattle in the UK. It appeared to be very similar to Scrapie. Loss of coordination, weight loss, change in temperament, tremors, low head carriage, nervousness, and eventual death. In the early 1980s, in order to keep up with the demand and make every pound stretch as far as possible, cow feed had begun to be made from processed leftover parts of other livestock animals. This included other cows, pig, sheep, and chickens. The cows that were eating this protein-rich feed made from scraps would allow the cattle to grow very quickly. This was not only unnatural for cows to be eating meat, as they are herbivores, but now the cattle were made into cannibals. Cattle wouldn't be the only ones to pay for this. By the time that this feeding practice was outlawed in 1988, over 1 million infected cows had been unknowingly sold to be used for human consumption. In 1990, the Agriculture and Food Minister of Britain, Andrew Gummer, proclaimed that there was no risk to humans. Even though this would have been a good time to use an abundance of caution, he pushed and declared that the UK's beef was safe for consumption, not only for adults but also for children. Since people had eaten Scrapie-infected meat for centuries, and BSE was observed to be the same type of condition just affecting cattle, the meat from the infected cows was surely safe. The agriculture industry threw everything at campaigns for the safety of beef. Not only that, but with the meat boom that they created, to satisfy the public's hunger, began using other parts of the cow usually discarded. They would process these parts, which included the spinal cord and brain of the cow. This mechanically recovered meat, as it was called, would be added to things like sausage. This was disastrous, as these parts were the most infectious parts of BSE-infected cattle. Just when you think it can't get any worse, due to public policies in the 1980s, school lunches were now privatized, and therefore the schools had to try to feed all those children as cheaply as possible. And how did they do this? With that cheap, mechanically recovered meat. So now children were put at an even higher risk than the general population. Not only that, but who else would be buying this mechanically recovered meat? The lower class. Remember when I said that Scrapie-infected meat was given to the servants to eat? Well, here it was repeating again. This time, though, there would be terrible consequences. When Steve Dealer, a microbiologist in the early 1990s, began experimenting with BSE in the lab, he observed that mice could actually contract BSE, and that cross-species jump wasn't impossible. He decided that he couldn't keep quiet about this, but the powers that be couldn't have that. So he was removed from his position and was no longer able to carry out his work on BSE. Soon, he would be proven right, though. In May 1990, people were told not to be alarmed, but that a pet cat had come down with something that appeared to be related. It had now jumped from one species to another, just as he thought possible. By the end of 1990, more than 15 pet cats would die from this new BSE-like condition, and 14 other species, including zoo animals, would be found to be infected after eating contaminated meat. Despite this new information, the agriculture minister would again claim that beef posed no risk to humans, and to prove this, he fed his daughter part of a hamburger right in front of the media. And tragically, he would be proven wrong. In May of 1995, BSE made history with its first human victim. May 21st, 1995, Stephen Churchill died at the age of 19. At first, it was believed that he had Creuztfeldt-Jakob Disease, or CJD, another prion disease, but he was uncharacteristically young for it. His brain was sent to a lab in Edinburgh that researches CJD, and they noticed under the microscope that his brain did have Spongiform encephalopathy, but there were features that weren't normal for the known types of CJD. CJD is the oldest known prion disease known to affect humans and was discovered in the 1920s by German neurologists. The symptoms include involuntary muscle jerking or movements, personality changes, insomnia, difficulty speaking, difficulty swallowing, vision abnormalities, impaired balance, and severe mental deterioration and dementia. Before the 1980s, CJD had been known to develop in three ways. CJD could be sporadic, meaning that it just spontaneously appeared, which usually affected people over the age of 60. 85% of cases are sporadic. The second way it develops is that it could be inherited, which accounts for 10 to 15% of cases. These cases are caused by inheriting a mutated gene, and how it affects a specific family that carries the gene will be determined by the specific change in that gene, as different changes result in different prion diseases. The third way it could develop is through acquiring a prion. The first case of acquired CJD was recognized in 1974 and occurred after a corneal transplant. Usually, acquired CJD is transmitted through surgical grafts of dura mater, which is a tissue that covers the brain, transplanted corneas, or implantation of inadequately sterilized electrodes in the brain during brain surgery. Acquired CJD is extremely rare and accounts for less than 1% of cases. And before the 1990s, it was unknown that it could also be acquired through consumption of infected animals. By the time they received the brain of the third teenager who died from this presentation of CJD, they knew they were looking at something new, a variant. And on March 8, 1996, emergency meetings were held by government scientists realizing that they now had a massive problem on their hands. They finally recognized that the agriculture ministry had been wrong. There was a new variant of Creuztfeldt-Jakob disease. This variant, known as VCJD, primarily began with psychiatric symptoms and had a longer than usual duration from onset of symptoms to death. To date, 178 people have died from this, the youngest being 15-year-old Claire McVeigh. The most recent victim died in 2016, and it is completely possible that that person wouldn't be the last considering the long incubation period of prion diseases. To this day, anyone who lived in the UK between 1980 and 1996 is not allowed to donate blood in another country because their blood could be silently carrying this disease, and there is no way to test for it. Anyone could be infected, and only time will tell who is. I will quickly mention another prion disease that only develops through inheriting a mutated gene. I was unable to find very much information on it as it's the rarest of the prions. Whereas Creuztfeldt-Jakob disease affects 1 in a million, this disease, Gerstmann-Straussler-Scheinker disease, only affects 1 in 100 million. It was first identified in 1936 by Austrian physicians and is known to affect at least 56 families worldwide. The average lifespan after diagnosis is 5 years, and the onset is usually between the 30s and 50s. A person experiencing GSS can have a lack of muscle coordination, dementia, slurring of speech, involuntary movement of the eyes, rigid muscle tone, and deafness. Death usually results from the person falling into an irreversible coma or from a secondary infection due to the loss of bodily function. The strangest prion disease has got to be Kuru. It was identified in the 1950s after anthropologists observed a tribe in Papua New Guinea suffering from a devastating disease, similar to CJD. Over the course of the outbreak, over 1,000 people would succumb to Kuru. The affected person would first start to experience a loss of coordination, difficulty walking, and they would appear to begin to shiver uncontrollably despite their tropical environment. The people would display erratic and often inappropriate emotions for a situation, such as outbursts of laughter for no apparent reason. Eventually, they would become unresponsive to their surroundings. Death would occur within 2 years of the onset of symptoms, usually due to pneumonia or secondary infection. What made the Kuru epidemic so notable was how it was transmitted. For so many people to develop it, it couldn't be sporadic, and it being inherited didn't make sense either. And when it was finally discovered how it passed from person to person, it would be shocking. Turns out that Kuru is transmitted in the same way that mad cow disease is, through consumption of contaminated meat. But what was shocking is that these people of Papua New Guinea weren't eating contaminated animals. They were eating their deceased family members in a practice called ritual cannibalism, and was seen as a way to respect the dead. It was a long tradition, and it is believed that somebody had probably died of CJD and was consumed. When they were consumed, the prion was passed on to their family. It was noticed that women and children had the highest rates of affliction, and this was because they were the ones who would traditionally consume the brains of the deceased, which just so happened to be the most contagious part. Once the practice of ritual cannibalism was identified as the cause of Kuru, it was quickly prohibited and the spread of Kuru halted. What is scary about this is that even after the practice was prohibited and it died out, a small number of cases appeared between 1996 and 2004. This meant, shockingly, that the incubation period of Kuru could be as long as 50 years. And now we come to our final prion disease. In my opinion, it's probably the most horrifying of the prion diseases. It can be sporadic and it can be inherited. The chance of developing the sporadic form is 1 in 30 million. I will be focusing on the inherited form, though, which is called fatal familial insomnia, or FFI. For FFI, once symptoms begin, life expectancy is usually between 6 months and 3 years. With the sporadic type, symptoms begin with a rapid decline in mental function and a loss of coordination. These people may not even be aware that they're not sleeping well. And with the familial type, early symptoms begin with minor difficulties falling and staying asleep, and occasional muscle twitching, spasms, and stiffness. During sleep, they may move a lot, especially as the disease progresses. The average age for onset is the 40s, but it can appear as early as the 20s or as late as the 70s. The director of the Prion Surveillance Center in Cleveland once remarked that before working with prions, he believed that Alzheimer's was the worst disease someone could get. One particular family in Venice, Italy, has been well known to have had FFI for over 2 centuries, and it was known that the family suffered from a curse where people died from insomnia. For a while, it was believed that this family was the only one in the world to suffer from it. In 1984, one person in the family, Silvano, began exhibiting symptoms, and he knew that he was the curse's most recent victim, and he knew he had only months to live. They didn't really know what the family curse was, just that it was brutal and quick. Silvano wanted answers, so he went to a sleep clinic in Bologna. They began recording him and began experimenting with treatments. They tried sleeping medications and even sedation, but to no avail. They soon discovered that the sufferers couldn't enter deep sleep, where sleep is reparative. They really only learned that sufferers were able to enter light phases of sleep, where dreaming occurs. Unfortunately, he passed away without ever really learning what was killing him. It was only during his autopsy that they learned that the thalamus in his brain had been destroyed, but still didn't know why. But at least now they could give it a name: fatal familial insomnia. In the early 1990s, members of the Italian family were all tested for the genetic mutation in hopes of helping along the research for FFI. Unlike other genetic conditions, prion diseases usually don't appear until after childbearing growing years. So usually the mutated gene is unwittingly passed on before the person even knows that they have it. The team researching it decided to refrain from informing the family about who tested positive, so those individuals couldn't use that information when deciding whether or not to have children. I don't know how ethical that is, especially with modern medicine, where it could be guaranteed that you're not passing on the genes, especially knowing that it can affect people as young as their 20s and essentially taking away their whole life. In 2010, Sonia Volib was in her second year of law school when her mom started to become sick. Her mom started having trouble with her eyesight and started losing weight rapidly. She had started to become forgetful, and soon she began to experience hallucinations and started experiencing paranoia. She would experience difficulty expressing herself and then would become aggressive when people didn't understand her. She underwent so many tests for things like Lyme disease and microscopic tumors. Even though her husband was a doctor, they were never able to find any answers. Within a year, she was on life support, and then she passed away at only 52 years old. And they still didn't know why. It was only after her autopsy that her family learned that FFI had killed her, and more devastating, that it was genetic, and Sonia had a 50% chance of having had inherited it. Thanks to modern medicine, she was able to go through genetic testing to learn if she had inherited it or not. After the blood draw, she had to wait 8 weeks to learn her fate. It was then that she learned that she had in fact inherited the gene. Her and her husband dove into trying to learn all they could about Sonia's new diagnosis. About a month later, she quit her job as a lawyer, and she began sitting in on biochemistry classes at MIT, and began a class on molecular biology at the Harvard Extension School. Her husband quit his job as a transportation engineer, and they've both become lab scientists working on finding a cure for FFI and other prion diseases. They have their own prion lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And now they are talking about starting clinical trials using gene therapy in the next few years. So perhaps a world without prion disease is just around the corner. We can hope. Anyway, that's it for today. If you wanted to learn more about today's topic, you can find some recommendations for books and documentaries below. Also below will be the links for the resources that I used. If you want to see more from me, like this video, subscribe and comment below on which disease you found particularly horrifying. Also see the community page to vote on next week's topic. Be merry, but stay morbid.